the summer of 1842, the air in southern Alabama hung heavy with the scent of magnolia and decay. The town of Ashbridge was small, its roads carved through red clay and bordered by cotton fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where gossip moved faster than mail, and where tragedy never truly left. It only changed its shape. That year, the townspeople gathered for what should have been a joyous occasion: the wedding of Mary Ellen Waverly, the daughter of a wealthy planter, and Thomas Reddick, a quiet man from the neighboring county. Their union was meant to strengthen the bond between two old families. But within days of their vows, the story of that wedding would become something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Mary Ellen was known throughout Ashbridge for her beauty, though it was not a gentle kind. Her eyes were pale, almost colorless, and her manner reserved to the point of discomfort. People often said she seemed to be watching rather than living, her expression one of quiet calculation. Thomas, by contrast, was mild and unremarkable, a man who worked the fields and avoided attention. The match had been arranged more by circumstance than affection. In the heat of that June, guests arrived in carriages, their silk dresses and starched collars sticking to their skin, unaware that the day they celebrated would mark the beginning of one of Alabama's most whispered tragedies. Accounts of the wedding differ depending on who tells the story. Some say the ceremony began like any other: music, prayer, and the clinking of glasses. Others insist that something felt wrong from the start, that the air was thick, that the bride's smile never reached her eyes. The reception was held in the Waverly home, a grand plantation house built from pine and brick, with white columns and a wraparound porch. By sunset, the guests had eaten and danced, and the couple withdrew upstairs to the bridal suite, while the sound of fiddles echoed below. No one saw what happened next, but before dawn, a scream tore through the house that froze every heart awake. When they found her, Mary Ellen was sitting beside her husband's body, her wedding dress stained a deep crimson. Thomas lay motionless on the floor, his face pale, a broken glass beside him. The bride was calm, too calm, and when the servants tried to take her away, she clutched the edge of the bed and whispered that she had only done what love demanded. It was not until the physician arrived that the true horror came to light. On her lips, faint but visible, were traces of blood, not from a wound of her own, but from her husband's. Whether by accident, madness, or some ritual no one dared name, the bride had drunk from the very cup that had held his life. The town was paralyzed. In 1840s Alabama, few things could scandalize a community more than a broken marriage vow. But this was something unholy. Word spread quickly beyond Ashbridge, carried by traders and traveling preachers. Newspapers from Montgomery and Mobile refused to print the full story, calling it a matter of grave indecency. Those who had attended the wedding began to recant their memories, convincing themselves that what they'd seen was a dream, that no respectable woman could commit such an act. Yet the house itself told a different story. In the weeks that followed, servants left one by one, claiming they heard footsteps in empty corridors and found water basins tinted pink in the morning light. Mary Ellen was not taken to prison. Her family, powerful and deeply embarrassed, claimed she had taken ill with fever and kept her confined to her room. Some say she spoke to no one for weeks. Others claim she prayed aloud each night, begging forgiveness for something she would never name. Thomas's body was buried quietly on the edge of the Waverly estate, far from the family plot. No minister would officiate, and the grave was marked only by a single uncut stone. In time, the story of the bride who drank her husband's blood became legend, a whisper passed down through generations, always changing, always haunting. Some called it madness, others said it was love twisted by superstition. A few believed she had been part of an old ritual meant to bind two souls together beyond death, a practice whispered about in the rural South where African, European, and Native beliefs sometimes blended in strange and secret ways. Whatever the truth was, the people of Ashbridge avoided the subject, as if silence itself could bury what had happened in that house. Decades later, long after both families had vanished from the region, travelers still reported strange sights near the ruins of the Waverly estate. A faint light flickering through broken shutters, a woman's voice humming an old wedding tune in the night, and sometimes on misty mornings, the faint outline of a white dress among the overgrown trees. Historians dismissed these accounts as folklore born of tragedy, yet the unease in the town persisted. It wasn't the violence that haunted them, but the motive. The idea that something as sacred as love could transform into a hunger so profound it defied the boundaries between life and death. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the story of Mary Ellen Waverly endures in Southern folklore as a warning about passion left unchecked. It is told in hushed voices beneath the creak of old porches and the buzz of summer insects, when the night feels too still and the heart remembers its darker desires. The bride, they say, never left that house. She lingers still, bound by the act that turned her wedding night into a legend of blood and silence. To understand what happened in Ashbridge in 1842, one must first understand Alabama itself at that time, a land both prosperous and cursed. Thriving on its cotton, yet haunted by the silence that wealth demanded. The state was young, barely 2 decades into its incorporation, and its identity was carved from the labor of enslaved people and the ambitions of a small, powerful elite. Plantations sprawled across the countryside, their white columns and wide porches symbols of status and control. The families who owned them lived in a fragile world built on appearances, where every smile was measured and every secret was buried under layers of propriety and prayer. The Waverly family was among these, landowners whose fortune came from cotton, sugar, and the quiet compliance of those forced to work their fields. Life in the deep South of the 1840s was a careful balancing act between refinement and repression. Society demanded grace and civility, yet just beneath that surface lived fear of scandal, of poverty, of divine punishment. Religion was central, a constant companion in both comfort and judgment. The church dictated morality, and every sin was thought to carry a physical consequence. Illness, madness, misfortune, these were not simply human afflictions but divine warnings. In such a world where everything was either blessed or cursed, the strange events that surrounded Mary Ellen Waverly's marriage were seen not as tragedy, but as a spiritual contamination. Women in that era lived within strict confines. They were daughters, wives, and mothers before they were individuals. A woman's purpose was to preserve her family's reputation and to remain pure, loyal, and obedient. Education was a privilege rarely extended beyond the domestic arts. Those who read widely, who questioned or spoke boldly, were often labeled unwell or unnatural. Mental illness, when it appeared, was treated with confinement and prayer rather than medicine. A woman who broke under pressure or grief was not seen as sick but as sinful. The mind itself was moralized, and this belief would shape how people later interpreted the bride's shocking act. The Waverly's plantation sat near a small river that cut through the red earth and thick forests. The house was large but isolated, and isolation in those days was its own kind of danger. Travel was slow and medical care was primitive. When people fell ill, they relied on folk remedies and superstition as much as on doctors. In rural Alabama, Christian prayer often mixed with older, darker practices. Folk rituals brought by enslaved Africans, charms whispered by Scots-Irish settlers, and healing incantations from native traditions. This blend of faith and fear created a landscape where the supernatural was never far from the everyday. To the people of Ashbridge, curses, hauntings, and bad air were as real as the soil beneath their feet. Economically, Alabama in the 1840s was prosperous, but the prosperity was hollow. The cotton boom had created immense wealth for a few, but for the majority, life remained precarious. Farmers who owned no land toiled endlessly to survive, while the enslaved endured unimaginable suffering in silence. In such a system, power was everything, and so was secrecy. Families like the Waverlys guarded their reputations with the same fervor they guarded their land. When tragedy struck, it was not to be shared, it was to be hidden. This was the cultural soil in which Mary Ellen's story took root. Marriage among the elite was often a matter of property and alliance, rather than affection. The union between Mary Ellen and Thomas Reddick was no exception. The Reddicks were of respectable lineage but had fallen on hard times, and the Waverlys saw the marriage as mutually beneficial. To the town, it was a cause for celebration, but for those inside the Waverly house, it was a quiet transaction, sealed not with love, but with obligation. The expectations on Mary Ellen were immense: to secure her family's standing, to produce heirs, and to embody the image of Southern virtue. The strain of that role, of being watched, judged, and silenced, could break even the most composed soul. Beyond the surface of gentility, there was another Alabama, a darker one. Hidden in the woods were makeshift cabins where enslaved people held their own secret gatherings, keeping alive fragments of the faiths their ancestors carried from across the ocean. These gatherings were not acts of rebellion, but of survival. Stories, songs, and rituals passed from generation to generation, often centered around blood, its sanctity, its symbolism, its link to life and spirit. Blood was seen as both sacred and dangerous, capable of healing or cursing. It is in this context that Mary Ellen's act would later be interpreted, not merely as madness, but as something ritualistic, something learned rather than imagined. The medical understanding of the time offered little clarity. Physicians in the South were beginning to categorize mental illnesses, though their explanations often blurred science and superstition. Conditions such as hysteria, melancholia, and mania were diagnosed mostly in women, attributed to emotional weakness or moral failure. Blood itself was central to medical theory. Many still believed in humoral balance, the ancient idea that temperament and health were controlled by fluids within the body. To restore balance, doctors bled patients, applied leeches, or prescribed purgatives. Within this framework, the idea of a woman consuming blood would have been viewed as both barbaric and symbolic, a violation of natural order. Religious leaders, too, shaped how the town processed tragedy. In Alabama's rural parishes, the pulpit carried immense power. Ministers interpreted every unusual event as a moral lesson. A death by lightning was a warning. A stillborn child was divine punishment. And so, when news of the Waverly wedding spread, it was not treated as a private calamity, but as evidence of sin infecting the moral fabric of the community. The people of Ashbridge were not simply horrified. They were afraid of what the event said about them, about their town, about the possibility that evil could grow unnoticed among the godly. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, whispers of occult practices had already made their way into Southern folklore. The idea that certain families carried old knowledge or blood curses was common in rural storytelling. These tales blended elements of Christianity and paganism, warning that those who sought power or forbidden love would always pay a price. When the tragedy of the Waverleys unfolded, it fit too neatly into these existing fears. To the people of Ashbridge, the act of drinking blood was not madness, it was blasphemy, an abomination echoing the darker tales their grandparents once told by candlelight. Thus, when historians look back at what happened that summer, they find a society already primed for fear, a place where belief and reason were at war, where the human mind was a mystery, and where a single act could become eternal legend. Mary Ellen Waverly did not simply live in Alabama. She lived at the crossroads of faith, folklore, and repression. Her story endures because it speaks to something deeper than horror, the way a culture can create the very darkness it fears, then condemn those who fall victim to it. The night of the wedding had left an uneasy quiet across the Waverly estate. Servants whispered that the house no longer sounded alive, as if laughter and music had been replaced by a deep, steady silence that clung to the walls. For days, Mary Ellen stayed confined to her room. The maids brought her food that went untouched, water that remained still on her bedside table. When her mother entered, she found the young bride sitting by the window in her torn wedding gown, staring at the woods where her husband had once walked. Her voice was calm when she spoke, almost detached. She said she could still hear Thomas calling her name, that he wasn't gone, only changed. The physician who came to examine her wrote that she was lucid but unnervingly tranquil, her eyes fixed as though she saw something no one else could. Weeks turned into months, and the story of what had happened that night began to spread like a fever. The official account was simple. Thomas Reddick had fallen, cut himself on a broken glass, and died from shock before help could reach him. But that explanation satisfied no one. The wounds on his neck and wrists were too deliberate, too clean to be accidental. The servants who washed the blood from the floor whispered that the glass had been shattered after he died, not before. Rumors emerged that there had been an argument, that the couple had fought behind the locked door, and that Mary Ellen had screamed only once, then nothing. When the doctor left, he told the family to keep her under watch, and for the rest of that summer, she remained hidden, the blinds drawn, her name never spoken in town. The details that emerged over time were fractured, inconsistent, and terrifying. A midwife named Ada Collins claimed she had been called to the house the morning after the wedding, though her testimony was never recorded officially. She described finding Mary Ellen with blood on her lips and fingers, holding a cup in both hands as if guarding something sacred. The smell in the room was sweet and metallic, and though the window had been opened, the air still felt heavy. When Ada asked her what had happened, Mary Ellen said quietly, "He wanted me to keep him close." The midwife left without another word and refused to return, saying later that she felt as though the air in that house was listening. As the months passed, strange accidents began to plague the estate. A stable boy was found unconscious after claiming to have seen a figure in white near the barn. 2 hounds went missing and were later discovered deep in the woods, their bodies untouched but their mouths stained dark. The servants refused to stay after nightfall, saying that they heard footsteps upstairs even when the rooms were empty. The Waverly family dismissed these claims as hysteria, but quietly they began to fear their own home. Mary Ellen's mother insisted that prayers be read daily, yet even the minister who came to bless the house said he felt watched as he spoke. In the autumn of that year, Mary Ellen's health began to decline. She grew pale and thin, her voice softer, her appetite gone. The family doctor prescribed tonics and fresh air, but nothing changed. Her mother claimed that she refused food yet never weakened, that she slept for days at a time but woke with bright, clear eyes. When asked what she ate, Mary Ellen only said that she found what she needed. The statement frightened everyone who heard it. By then, the servants had begun to leave in pairs, taking detours through the fields rather than passing beneath her window. In December, a cold wind swept through Ashbridge, and one morning, the family awoke to find the parlor door open and a trail of red drops leading toward the stairs. They followed it to Mary Ellen's room. She was sitting at her vanity brushing her hair, her reflection calm, her gown spotless. On the table before her was a folded handkerchief soaked through with dried blood. When her mother asked whose it was, she smiled faintly and said, "He comes to me at night. He still loves me." The doctor was summoned again, and though he examined her carefully, he found no wounds. His notes, later recovered from his estate, read only, "Her pulse is steady. Her skin is cold as marble. She insists she has not sinned." The following spring, the Waverly estate began to decline. The crops failed, the workers left, and the family withdrew further into secrecy. Locals avoided the property, claiming that the soil itself had turned sour. Hunters said their dogs refused to cross the boundary of the fields. Travelers passing through spoke of a single light burning in the upper window long after midnight, flickering like a candle against the dark. Some believed Mary Ellen had lost her mind, others that she had made a covenant with forces older than faith. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between fear and fascination. By the summer of 1843, a year after the wedding, another tragedy struck. Mary Ellen's younger brother was found dead near the river that bordered the estate. His throat bore a small cut, shallow but deliberate. The sheriff ruled it an accident, saying he must have fallen while fishing, yet few believed it. The family buried him quietly beside Thomas's grave. At the funeral, Mary Ellen appeared for the first time in public since the night of her wedding. She wore black lace and a veil, her movements slow and deliberate. Those who stood near her claimed that she hummed softly to herself, a tune they recognized as the wedding hymn. When the ceremony ended, she placed her hand on her husband's grave and whispered something too low to hear. Moments later, the wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic scent through the air. In the weeks that followed, people began to vanish from the surrounding area. A woodcutter who worked near the Waverly property disappeared without trace. A pair of travelers on their way to Montgomery were found abandoned by the roadside, their horses spooked, their wagon empty. Whispers grew louder, suggesting that the bride's curse had spread beyond her house. No one could prove it, yet no one dared to go near her. The sheriff visited once more, found the house in disarray, and claimed that Mary Ellen was gone. Only her room remained untouched, its sheets clean, its air unnaturally cold, and the faint trace of iron lingering still. By the end of that decade, the Waverly estate stood abandoned. The family left Alabama altogether, their fortune spent, their name avoided in polite company. The house remained, aging and silent, its shutters falling, its roof caving inward. Local children called it the Blood Bride's home, daring each other to run up the porch steps and touch the door before sunset. Some claimed that if you listened closely, you could still hear her voice from the upstairs window, asking softly if anyone had seen her husband. Historians who studied the account later described it as an example of mass hysteria, a case where grief, isolation, and fear created a legend from an unexplainable death. But those who lived near Ashbridge swore the story was true, that the air itself still remembered what had happened inside those walls. To this day, the tragedy of Mary Ellen Waverly is remembered not for the blood or the death, but for the silence that followed. A silence so complete, it seemed to consume sound, memory, and time itself. A silence that began the moment she lifted the cup and drank. When the first newspapers caught wind of the Waverly story, the headline was subdued, almost polite. Young husband found dead on wedding night. The Montgomery Sentinel printed only a brief notice citing domestic tragedy and unspecified causes. But beneath that thin layer of civility, the community of Ashbridge began to split between disbelief and dread. People talked in lowered voices at the general store, at the post office, at the steps of the church. They speculated not about Thomas's death, but about his wife, what she had done, what she might still be doing, and whether she should have been left alone at all. Within weeks, the story took on a new shape. Letters written by guests of the wedding began circulating across Alabama, each containing slightly different details. One claimed that the bride had fainted before cutting the cake. Another said she had danced barefoot on the porch, singing a song that no one recognized. A third said that when she kissed her husband's hand during the ceremony, he had flinched as though the touch burned him. None of these versions could be verified, but together they formed a mosaic of unease. A portrait of a young woman possessed, not by madness but by something older, something unspoken. Religious leaders in the area found themselves forced to address it. The pastor of the Ashbridge Chapel, Reverend Elijah Monroe, gave a sermon on the sanctity of flesh and spirit, in which he warned against pride, obsession, and unnatural devotion between husband and wife. His words were not subtle. "There are covenants," he said, "that do not come from God but from the dark corners of the earth where silence waits." The congregation understood what he meant, and for weeks afterward, attendance doubled. People came not to pray, but to protect themselves. They whispered her name during communion, as if invoking it would keep the evil away. Meanwhile, physicians and scholars began to discuss the case in more clinical terms. Dr. Henry Caldwell, A.D. Wancher, surgeon from Mobile, published a paper suggesting that Mary Ellen suffered from a form of melancholic mania, a term used at the time to describe women who lost touch with reality following emotional shock. He speculated that her husband's death had caused a psychotic break, leading her to believe that consuming his blood, or believing she had, was an act of preservation rather than desecration. His analysis was logical, methodical, and entirely detached from the horror of it. But those who lived closer to the Waverly estate dismissed it outright. Science, they said, could not explain why dogs refused to enter the house, or why a lamp left burning there never seemed to go out. For every rational explanation, a darker one took root. Some locals claimed that the Waverly family had practiced forms of old country superstition brought from Ireland and Wales, rituals involving blood, soil, and vows that bound the living to the dead. Others whispered that Mary Ellen had been visited by an omen before her wedding, a bird flying backward across her window, a mirror cracking without touch, a candle extinguishing at noon. In the South of the 1840s, such symbols were not taken lightly. Folk beliefs wove themselves through Christian sermons and supper table prayers. To many, Mary Ellen was not insane, she was marked. By the following year, the legend had spread beyond Alabama. The New Orleans Daily Picayune published an article titled "The Crimson Bride of Ashbridge," describing her as a southern specter whose devotion defied the grave. The tone was sensational, even mocking, but the story captivated readers. Some treated it as a ghost tale, others as a moral warning. Women were advised to guard their emotions, to resist the hysterical weakness of loving too much. In drawing rooms and parlors, her name became shorthand for passion turned poisonous. A mother might whisper, "Don't go Waverly on him," meaning, don't lose yourself to love. Inside Ashbridge itself, the remaining members of the Waverly family lived in quiet exile. They dismissed visitors, refused correspondence, and forbade their servants to speak to outsiders. Yet silence only fueled speculation. Local boys dared each other to sneak onto the estate and bring back proof of the blood bride. One boy claimed he saw her standing at the upstairs window, pale as chalk, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Another said that when he threw a stone at the house, it came back and struck his own leg. Over time, these tales blended into the folklore of the town, recited each autumn when the fog rolled in from the river. Doctors from neighboring towns attempted to study her case, but they found no trace of Mary Ellen after the spring of 1843. Her name appeared once more in public records, in a letter from a Montgomery apothecary noting an order for large quantities of iron tonic and leeches. After that, nothing. Some believed she had been taken to an asylum under a false name. Others claimed she simply vanished, leaving her room untouched and her reflection imprinted in the mirror. Theological debates erupted quietly within the clergy. Could blood be a form of covenant between souls? Could a woman's grief transform into something physical, something that defied divine law? Reverend Monroe himself grew reclusive after visiting the estate a final time. When asked what he saw, he replied only, "There are prayers too late to be said." As decades passed, the Waverly case became a kind of cultural stain, a story retold in pamphlets, sermons, and traveling medicine shows. Each version changed the tone. To some, Mary Ellen was a victim of patriarchal oppression and unacknowledged illness. To others, she was a warning, a witch, or the embodiment of cursed love. But in all retellings, one image remained the same, a bride in her wedding gown, sitting before a mirror streaked with red, whispering to someone who was no longer there. Modern historians, writing from the comfort of archives and lecture halls, often try to rationalize the story. They cite the lack of forensic tools in 1842, the prevalence of bloodletting and medical ignorance, the psychological trauma of isolation and societal pressure. They argue that the legend of the blood bride is a reflection of a culture terrified by female grief, by its intensity and its refusal to conform. And perhaps they are right. Yet for those who have stood before the ruins of the Waverly estate, who have heard the wind move through its broken shutters, reason feels thin. There's something in the air, a weight, a memory that logic cannot explain. By the turn of the century, the story was no longer just local history. It had become folklore. Parents told it to their children as a warning about obsession and forbidden vows. Old-timers swore they had seen her shadow near the river on moonless nights, her dress faintly glimmering in the dark. And though time has eroded the details, the people of Alabama still speak her name with a kind of reluctant reverence. Mary Ellen Waverly, the bride who drank her husband's blood. Not a monster, not a saint, but a woman caught forever in the thin space between love and death, where faith and fear are one and the same. The night the story reached its peak began like any other in the decaying Waverly estate. The house, now half swallowed by vines and rot, sat deep in the folds of the Alabama wilderness. The air hung thick with humidity, and the insects outside seemed to hum in strange rhythms, as if echoing a pulse that belonged to something unseen. Inside, a single lamp burned in the upper room. Those who lived nearby claimed that sometimes they could see her silhouette move across the window, a slender figure in a pale gown, pacing slowly, as though rehearsing a ritual only she remembered. In the weeks leading up to the final event, Mary Ellen had grown quieter, speaking to no one except through brief notes left on her dresser. Her handwriting had become erratic, looping and broken, as if she wrote while trembling. The last of these notes was addressed not to a living soul, but to her husband, Thomas. It read, "The bond was not broken, only spilled. You are still here. I will come to you as I did before, through what remains." Her relatives found the note but said nothing. They had already begun locking their bedroom doors at night. The night of July 3rd, 1843, brought a violent storm. The thunder rolled across the hills and made the windows of the Waverly house shudder in their frames. A servant named Clara, who had stayed out of pity rather than loyalty, later told neighbors that she heard the bride singing over the sound of the rain. It was not a hymn nor a melody anyone recognized. The song rose and fell like a slow chant, low and rhythmic, carrying through the halls like the murmur of prayer. Clara, frightened, tried to open her door, but found it stuck, as though something heavy pressed against it from the outside. Upstairs, in the master bedroom, Mary Ellen had laid out her wedding gown again, now yellowed and brittle with age. She had washed and combed her hair until it gleamed, then set 2 goblets on the vanity beside her. One was filled with red wine. The other, though no one saw it but her, held something thicker, darker. A single candle burned in front of the mirror, its flame bending and twitching with the wind that slipped through the cracked panes. She sat before it, her eyes sunken yet wide, and whispered to the reflection, "We are one flesh, one heart, one promise." When lightning struck a nearby oak, it lit up the whole room for an instant. In that brief white glare, she saw not her own reflection, but Thomas's face staring back. His expression was calm, almost tender. The illusion might have come from exhaustion, grief, or the play of light, but to Mary Ellen it was real. She raised the second goblet, pressed it to her lips, and drank deeply. The candle guttered and went out. What followed was pieced together from conflicting testimonies. Clara, still trapped in her room, claimed she heard a sharp cry, followed by what she described as the sound of glass breaking inside a bell. The neighbors, alerted by the lightning and the smell of smoke, saw the upper windows flare briefly with light, then go dark. When they arrived, the house was silent except for the rain. The front door was sealed from within, as it had been once before. They broke it down with axes. Inside, the scene was one of strange calm. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and wine. The furniture was undisturbed, but the mirror on the vanity had cracked clean down the middle. On one side of the glass, the reflection of the candle still flickered. On the other, there was nothing at all. Mary Ellen sat before it, motionless, her hands resting on her lap, her head tilted slightly as though listening for something only she could hear. Her skin was pale, her lips faintly stained, and in front of her were the 2 goblets, one overturned, the other untouched. The coroner who arrived the next morning noted that her body showed no signs of struggle or trauma. The cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by nervous exhaustion. Yet the blood samples taken from the scene, preserved in small glass vials, were found to contain an unusual concentration of iron and copper, ratios not consistent with either human or animal blood. The vials were later lost from county records, though rumors claimed one had been sent to a doctor in New Orleans who used it for medical experiments. The funeral was held quietly 2 days later, with only a few relatives in attendance. The pastor refused to officiate, declaring that she had bound herself to an unholy covenant. Her coffin was sealed and buried beside Thomas's, though many claimed it was empty, that the family had decided to keep her body inside the house, hidden from public shame. Whatever the truth, the property was abandoned soon after. Within months, vines crept through the windows, the roof collapsed inward, and the road leading to the estate disappeared beneath weeds and red clay. But the story did not end there. Travelers who passed through Ashbridge reported strange occurrences near the old Waverly grounds. Lights seen flickering in the empty windows, the faint sound of a woman humming, carried on the wind. Some claimed that on humid nights, when the fog hung low, they could see a figure in white standing at the edge of the overgrown path, holding a glass that caught the moonlight like liquid fire. For decades, no one dared to reclaim the land. Farmers who tried found their cattle falling ill or their wells running dry. Children spoke of hearing someone whisper their names when they strayed too close to the river. In 1896, a traveling photographer attempted to capture the ruins of the Waverly house. When he developed the plate, the image showed not an empty parlor, but 2 figures seated together at the table, their faces blurred, their hands clasped over 2 gleaming goblets. The photograph was dismissed as a chemical error, yet no one could explain the faint shadow of a wedding veil hovering behind them. In the decades that followed, scholars revisited the case in books and lectures. Some viewed it as a parable of repressed grief, a warning about the psychological toll of isolation and superstition. Others argued it was evidence of mass hysteria, a local myth born from the moral panic of the 19th century South. But to those who lived in Ashbridge, explanation was irrelevant. They knew what they had seen. They knew what they still heard on nights when the air grew heavy and the river mist crept up the hill. The climax of Mary Ellen's story is not simply her death, it is the persistence of her presence, the refusal of the land to forget, Even now, when historians mention her name, they do so with an uneasy pause, as if the telling itself might summon her back. The Waverly estate remains untouched, the soil still dark where the foundation once stood. Some say the earth there will never grow grass, as though it remembers too well what was poured into it. Time, they say, heals all wounds. But in Ashbridge, time only deepened the silence. By the early 1900s, the Waverly estate had been reduced to little more than a hollow foundation, and a few collapsed beams buried under moss and ivy. The earth had reclaimed it, yet the memory refused to die. People spoke of the place in hushed tones, never by name, only the house beyond the pines. Children were warned not to wander there, not because of ghosts, but because of something far quieter and more unnerving, the feeling that someone was still watching from behind the ruins. Historians who revisited the story in the 20th century found themselves struggling to separate fact from folklore. The death record still existed, though faded with age. They confirmed Thomas's sudden passing, Mary Ellen's burial, and the coroner's signature written in a trembling hand. Beyond that, the evidence dissolved into rumor. Diaries, local letters, and church registers hinted at a wider pattern. Unexplained illnesses, strange rituals, small-town hysteria, but none could say with certainty where truth ended and imagination began. Yet in every account, the same unease lingered, an awareness that grief, when sealed away, does not disappear. It transforms. Folklorists from the University of Alabama later categorized the tale as a Southern blood covenant legend, one of several stories from the antebellum South involving death, devotion, and forbidden rites of union. They compared it to Appalachian mourning customs, where widows kept locks of their husband's hair or drops of blood as sacred tokens. But what made Mary Ellen's case unique was how it blurred the line between love and consumption. To drink even symbolically from one's beloved was to claim unity beyond death. To the superstitious, it was a desperate gesture of faith. To modern scholars, it was an early glimpse of how mental illness could masquerade as ritual. The few scientific investigations that followed were inconclusive. One anthropologist, writing in the 1930s, suggested that Mary Ellen may have suffered from a rare form of delusional parasitosis combined with grief hallucinations, a condition where the mind convinces the body of physical decay. Others speculated about contamination from local groundwater rich in iron, possibly causing hallucinations or poisoning. These theories offered comfort to those seeking logic, but they failed to address the deeper, quieter horror of the Waverly story. That human love, when untethered from reason, can devour itself. By mid-century, the legend had grown into a cautionary folktale. Traveling preachers used it in sermons about temptation and obsession. Novelists borrowed its imagery, the bride, the cup, the mirror, and turned it into Southern Gothic fiction. Yet for those who lived in the region, the story remained personal. Families still avoided the road that once led to the Waverly estate. On certain nights, hunters swore they heard a woman's voice calling softly through the fog, repeating a single name. Some believed it was Thomas's. Others said it was her own. In 1962, a team of archaeologists from Birmingham State attempted to locate the graves of the Waverlys. What they found instead were fragments, a broken mirror frame, bits of glass fused to the earth, and two rusted silver goblets buried side by side. When cleaned, both bore faint etchings of initials, TW and MEW, and beneath them, a single word carved in script, forever. The objects were quietly placed in storage and the site was reburied. No formal report was ever published. Even today, the area remains oddly untouched by development. Surveyors who visit speak of compass needles spinning unpredictably, of strange magnetic interference around the old foundation stones. Locals say animals avoid the place entirely. At dusk, the air grows colder there, and the wind seems to move in circles, whispering through the trees like a faint breath. Some believe it is only coincidence, topography, humidity, magnetic minerals. But those who stand there too long often leave pale, shaken, unable to describe what they felt except as a sudden awareness of being seen. The tale of Mary Ellen Waverly endures not because of proof, but because of resonance. It embodies a kind of Southern dread, the mixture of faith, guilt, and longing that has haunted the region for centuries. Her story speaks to the human impulse to preserve what we cannot bear to lose, even at the cost of reason or sanctity. Whether she truly drank from her husband's blood or merely believed she did no longer matters. What remains is the question she leaves behind. How far can devotion go before it becomes desecration? Every few years, someone attempts to write her story anew. Each version tries to explain her, to soften her, to make her understandable. But perhaps she resists that. Perhaps her legacy is meant to stay fragmented, like the mirror that once reflected her final act. 1,000 broken pieces, each showing a slightly different truth. And if you were to walk through Ashbridge tonight, past the old pines and the stretch of road no longer marked on any map, you might find yourself standing before the clearing where the house once stood. You might feel the air shift, the silence tighten around you. You might catch a faint scent of iron, of rain on old wood. And if you listen closely, you might hear a woman's voice, soft and steady, whispering words of a vow never released. A vow that belonged not just to one marriage, but to the eternal hunger of love itself, the kind that consumes, remembers, and refuses to die. For in the end, the story of the bride who drank her husband's blood is not a tale of evil. It is a mirror held up to the heart's darkest yearning, to keep what time demands we let go. And somewhere, in the soil of Alabama, that yearning still breathes.